All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, a land of plaid and coffee. This is David, and you know what? Real quick, I know I'm probably not the first one to say this to you, but Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas to you and to your families. I know that this has been quite the year, and I know it's still going to be. I guess, you know what? I'm going to get a little political here for a second. I know that some of these politicians out here are going to try to bury some fear into us and continue all of this crazy nonsense of everything. But I do want to say this real quick. It has just been a massive pleasure to have you enjoy this this creative part of me here over at PacWest Bigfoot. And so from me to you and yours, a very Merry Christmas. And do yourself a favor this year. Do me a favor this year. For the rest of this year, have a very Merry Christmas and a very happy holiday season, okay? Let's do that. Sounds good? All right. So, real quick, any shout-outs? Do want to give a shout out, of course, to my good friend Mike over there at Bigfoot's Wilderness, Gunner over there at Sasquatch Coffee Company. Also, I want to give a kind of a shout out to, I don't know if you guys have it yet, but it's Joshua Calhoun. I don't know if you guys have the book When They Call, but it is really awesome. And Josh, I'm going to have you on here pretty soon. I've just been really busy. And guess what, guys? I am going to get that tooth pulled tomorrow. So there you go. With that, that's really about it. So let's get into this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. This one is a boy and a Christmas tree farm and Bigfoot. I am not sure of all the ins and outs of Christmas tree farming today, but back then it was a simple living. Hard work, but a simple, worthwhile living could be had. The craziest part of it, though, was Bigfoot. My parents owned the property up in the northern part of Idaho between the early parts of the 1950s, basically around 1951 to be exact, and to the day they sold it around the early part of 1970. They moved out here from Pennsylvania, a place you could say birthed the idea of Christmas tree farming in the U.S. But Bigfoot, well, that thing was here before we were. And I will tell you that while they are unpredictable, once in a while you get to encounter one like this, pretty close up. A Christmas tree farm. I bet you didn't know, but most 19th century Americans found Christmas trees an oddity. They did. And the first record, one being on display, was in the 1830s by the German settlers of Pennsylvania, although trees had been a tradition in many German homes much earlier. And as a matter of fact, the Pennsylvanian German settlements had community trees as early as 1747. It was right after the war that my dad would cash in on some of his military income and move us out to Idaho to become Christmas tree farmers. To this day, my sons and daughter and my grandchildren and now my great-grandchildren love the holidays, Christmas in particular. And although we left tree farming behind, two of my boys own Christmas shops, one in Boise and the other over in Oregon. It seems our Savior's birthday was something that this family will carry in their blood for generations to come, I suppose. And, well, that is a good thing. For us, the first week of December and sometimes on Thanksgiving is when our season always started. And today I am asked to tell my story of a visitor to our little Christmas tree farm, a visitor that was, well, supposedly part of myth and legend. But as you'll learn, it is as real as you and me. It would come around during the harshest of months, late fall through winter, visiting us, letting us know it was there. And once, well, I can tell you that while they are truly unpredictable, sometimes you meet one, or at least come into the briefest of contact with one that does not fit the norm. I know, because I did. A boy. My father made it home from Germany alive and well, within about 2 to 3 years of him being home and learning all about Christmas trees, farming Christmas trees. Of course, he already knew a lot about farming, which my grandparents, his parents, were farmers. But this particular farming was new to him and my mom. He learned all he could and saved them some money, enough to buy a piece of property out west, way out west in Idaho. Just an hour or two below the Canadian border is where we would be, where I would basically know as home. My dad had always loved Christmas, almost as much as my mother. Today, I think my great-grandchildren would call them Christmas freaks, I think it is. If that is so, then that is what I would politely describe them as being. Not that I would ever do that. I was 1 year old when we moved there, but I was 12 when this part of the story began. These encounters with this, well, it was a real-life Bigfoot in the very early part of the 1960s. Before all the hoopla hippie stuff had gotten started, life was great on the farm, business was good, and I was actually working it too. Every day after school and in the morning before baseball games or church on the weekends, I helped with the farm. From keeping the aisles clean to many weeds, to making sure certain molds and bugs were not infesting and killing any of our crop. I would help out with every aspect. My favorite time of the year was Christmas, especially those days that led up to Christmas, when the large trucks from Boise and over in Washington would buy some trees from us to sell at stores and the Christmas tree lots in their cities and towns. For the most part, though, we sold a ton to Boise and local stores, and the ever-growing population of entrepreneurs looking to make some of that awesome holiday cash, selling Christmas trees on lots, and some from their own stores. Back then, we were pretty well known for Christmas tree farming, and I think one of the first to offer hot cocoa to our customers that came to get their cut-your-own on the farm. My mother made the cocoa. My dad and I helped customers get their trees cut, tied, and in or on top of their car. But that night, the one crazy night, I would hear little... I wouldn't hear little hoofs on the rooftop. Instead, I would hear howling off in the distance, howling like no other I'd heard up to that point from anything I knew to be roaming the area around our farm. Unlike much of Idaho, we have some mountains up north, large ones, and forests as thick as anywhere else in the Pacific Northwest. Okay, maybe not the Olympic Peninsula, but thick and dark enough to hide such a creature, for sure. That night, and I remember everything like it was yesterday, it was Thanksgiving, and that night would start a part of my life I would never forget. A Bigfoot. It was a long day, but I never thought the night would last even longer. Some family on my mom's side had come from back east to visit for a week that year, see the sights along the way, enjoy the farm and Thanksgiving, to usher in the Christmas season, and visit with us. This because this was far and few between, being so far apart. But I still had my room to myself, as my two cousins, twins the both of them, took up near the fireplace downstairs in the living room. Finally, the first night of family visiting came to a close, and I was hurried off to bed, as the next day would be really busy getting things ready for the season. I left the window open a bit. My room was sweltering, and I was not too fond of it being too warm when I hit the sack. I like to read, so I pulled out my book and started where I left off the night before. Yeah, I was not a few pages in when I heard something coming from outside the house, outside the window, in fact. Howling, but far off in the distance, that was for sure. It sounded as if it were coming from the back 10's direction, that being the furthest 10 acres away from the house. Back there, it was mostly silver-tipped trees covering nearly half that 10 acres, with nothing but a small open area between them and the mountains beyond. I walked over to the window and continued to listen to it. I remember it being, well, a bit eerie for sure. It was like an old lady wandering around howling, but with lungs of that of Superman himself. They had to be if it were a woman out there howling like that. It did, though. It sounded like more of a person than an animal, but not 100% human. Not completely. The next morning, I asked my cousins if they heard the howling. And of course, they thought I'd gone crazy, and instead letting everyone know at breakfast that I was hearing things at night. Nobody else heard a thing. Just me. Who's there? Almost a week later, a day before my cousins and my aunt and uncle would be leaving, my cousin Carol and I would find something rather odd on the back 10 one morning. Again, before I tell you what we found, the howls continued. Not much, but here and there throughout the week. I found myself curious about what in the world was out there howling in the night. I wondered if I was wrong about everything, and it was probably just a coyote, a wolf, or some other known animal out there causing the eerie sounding noise at night. What we found were, well, to our surprise, footprints. We huffed and puffed it back to my mom and dad, who were busy on the front few acres checking for any disease or crazy fungus as usual before we opened up the farm for customers. We told them about the footprints in the new snow that had fallen overnight. They followed us back, reluctantly of course, but they did nonetheless. We were correct. It was the shape of an actual human-like prints. Rather large ones too. At least they had the shape of it. My dad said, and to everyone's surprise, it could be a Bigfoot, something I never heard of before that moment. I was unsure if he was joking or telling the truth about the Bigfoot thing, so I asked him after dinner that night. By the fire, over some cocoa and popcorn, my dad told me about the myth of Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. Old tales and legends, for the most part, he'd heard from some of the local farmers and residents over the years. And by the time he was done filling my poor little head with some massive monster of the woods stories, he popped the balloon of fear with the fact that he believed that someone was most likely out in the back 10 with a large pair of shoes on trying to steal a tree or two. I have to admit, I saw no real toe depressions in the tracks. So I believed my dad. I had no other reason not to anyways. But a week later, I learned that he was, telling the truth when it came to the legend, and was completely wrong in believing it was a person with large feet trying to steal trees. My aunt and uncle and cousins were gone. It was back to just me and my parents. Again, the howling was back, and while this time my dad heard it, he told me it was just a wolf, and to be careful during the day out and about, and that if I spotted one or the sign of one, to let him know. It was not a wolf I spotted that very next evening. Not even close. I was out that weekend, and things were on the move. People were coming to get their Christmas trees, and we were loading some on trucks to be delivered to buyers around the state. We were near closing when I had seen something, a literal beast of a thing, in the back 10. It was truly a life-changing moment. My dad had me go and make sure folks were gone before I locked the gates for the night. There was one car left in the front of the property, so someone was out there. A husband and a wife were dragging a tree behind them and moving rather rapidly and looking nervously back over their shoulder, I would come to find. I stopped them and asked if they needed help, and they said they were cutting the tree when they started hearing some growling from all around them, as if a large predator was circling them slowly and menacingly. I told them they could head on up to the front. My mom would be happy to help them out, and my dad would go and check out things. Well, I decided to do that myself. And, I would soon realize that was not the brightest plan ever. Never, ever. That was for sure. Like a tall, hairy man. I headed deeper into the back 10 and seeing how it was getting near sunset, and I could still see around pretty well. So I figured I'd head back to the edge of the crop of trees and take a look out into the open field to see if I could see anything. Boy, did I. I stood there, finally, as I reached the last line of trees, staring out and taking in the massive expanse of the countryside and mountains before me. The snow had fallen again, and all was white as the sheets on my bed. I kept scanning the horizon, when I heard movement within the trees themselves. Whatever it was not all that far from me. Panic set in, and my heart was racing even more. It felt like it was already halfway to the house, leaving my mind and my body behind. Growling, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from nowhere, simultaneously came from everywhere. It was so powerful, its vibration could be felt from my head to my toes, physically speaking, of course. Then there was movement, and unfortunately, it came from the exact direction I would need to flee back to the house and my parents, who had no idea the trouble I was in at that moment that I knew I was in. I stood completely still, something my father taught me to do when confronted by a wild animal, or a person for that matter. A military man and all, he always said to give the other person the first move. Then he could better judge how to leverage the situation, and from every angle too. I stood there, as frozen as the landscape around me. A breeze blew, a light one. But the smell of it brought with it had me almost gagging a bit. Enough to put my hands over my nose and mouth. It was like rotten meat and skunk mixed. I'd never smelled anything like it before. Then just to my right and out of the direction I needed to flee, I looked at what I thought was at first a tree swaying back and forth in the wind. But I quickly realized the wind was not strong enough to create such an event. And I also realized that was no tree, but something crouched down, swaying back and forth, and looking right at me. The breeze came up again from the direction of this thing, the black mass of what looked like hair, and again I could smell that awful, nasty, and disgusting thing. I shivered where I stood and started trying to yell, but I could not. I couldn't get a single word out through my frozen lips. I was just too scared. Then, without warning, this thing stood up and on two legs. I felt like I was about to pass out. Everything in my body screamed except my voice. My words and breath to push them out were still frozen deep down inside me. I started shaking, practically convulsing at that point. This monster, this Bigfoot, just stood there with a menacing face and a mean and ornery-looking scowl. Its breathing was heavy. Its mouth was slightly open, showing hints of yellowish teeth. The hair, solid black in color, I recall, covered its entire body and all of its face, minus a bit of the large, flat nose and a bit around the forehead. The skin was a dark charcoal-like color and like worn leather, and it looked, well, like a crazy-looking ape, I guessed. Suddenly, it seemed to make a strange, moaning sound and looked back towards the house. I practically wet myself when I finally heard something that would later seem like an angel's voice to me. It was my mother's voice yelling out my name as she came closer and closer. That thing turned and bolted off faster than anything I'd ever seen run, and once I saw a cheetah run, and this thing would have run that cat over for sure. But finally my mother reached me and I fell into her arms. I remember sobbing, crying, shaking violently, and was, at that point, mentally exhausted. She said I was in massive shock. The doctor was called out, and I was told that I kept mumbling Sasquatch, Sasquatch, Sasquatch over and over. Merry Christmas, Bigfoot. I ended up better a couple days later. But it took months before I was safe. I felt safe working out and about in the trees by myself, or even more than 5 yards away from my mom and dad. And I never saw it again. And my parents finally believed my story as they finally saw toe impressions in the snow at that time. But that is what happened that Christmas season on the farm. And I'll never, ever forget it. Charles.